Show more February 8. December 16, 1944. Dwight Eisenhower sat in his office at SHEF headquarters in Versailles, staring at a map that had stopped making sense 6 hours earlier. The reports coming through were fragmentary, contradictory, and increasingly impossible to reconcile with what his intelligence staff had been telling him for weeks. No major German offensive capability. Enemy formations depleted. The war winding down toward a grinding, inevitable Allied victory sometime in early 1945. Now his 8-corps sector in the Ardennes was collapsing. The first indication came at 0530 that morning. A message from V Corps reporting heavy artillery fire along an 80-mile front. Not probing attacks. Not local counterattacks. A full-scale bombardment that lit up the frozen Belgian forest like a phosphorus flare. By noon, German armor had been identified pushing through the Losheim Gap. By 1600 hours, entire American divisions were out of contact. Eisenhower had spent the day attempting to construct a coherent picture from chaos. The 106th Infantry Division, green and untested, had been overrun near the Schnee-Eifel. The 28th Infantry Division, still recovering from the meat grinder of Hürtgen Forest, was fragmenting under mass panzer assault. Gaps were opening in a line that German armor was pouring through like floodwater, finding every crack in a dam. What disturbed him most wasn't the tactical situation. He'd seen worse. Kasserine Pass had been worse. What disturbed him was a realization forming in his mind as he cross-referenced unit positions, supply depots, and road networks across Belgium and Luxembourg. The Germans weren't just attacking. They were driving for Antwerp. It was the only explanation that made the offensive coherent. Every other hypothesis dissolved under scrutiny. This was a spoiling attack to disrupt Allied preparations. This wasn't a limited operation to straighten the line or capture supply dumps. The weight of force, the frontage, the axis of advance, all of it pointed to a single desperate and tactically brilliant objective. Split the Allied armies, capture the port that fed the entire northern supply line, and force a negotiated peace before American industrial power ground Germany into dust. Eisenhower stood and walked the map, tracing the roads west from the breakthrough zones. The Germans would need to move fast. Their entire operational concept depended on speed, on outrunning Allied reaction time, on capturing fuel depots intact to keep their panzers moving. They'd planned this for months, husbanding armor and fuel reserves while Allied intelligence assumed they were finished. He'd been wrong. Not about German strength in the strategic sense. They were still losing the war. But he'd been wrong about their willingness to stake everything on one last operational gamble. Hitler had done exactly what rational military analysis suggested he couldn't do, shouldn't do, and wouldn't do. The night deepened. His staff filtered in with updated reports, each one worse than the last. The 106th Division's 2 forward regiments were encircled on the Schnee-Eifel. Nearly 9,000 men cut off in the opening hours. German paratroopers had dropped behind American lines to seize crossroads and spread confusion. English-speaking German commandos in American uniforms were operating across the rear areas, cutting communication lines and misdirecting traffic. But the armored spearheads were what mattered. 3 separate panzer armies were driving west. Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, Otto von Manchefeld's 5th Panzer Army in the center, and Erich Brandenberger's 7th Army in the south. The northern thrust was already past Malmedy, heading for the Meuse crossings. If they reached the river before American reserves could establish a defensive line, the entire Allied position in Belgium became untenable. Eisenhower pulled a chair close to the map table and sat down. His chief of operations stood nearby, waiting. "Get me Bradley," Eisenhower said. General Omar Bradley commanded 12th Army Group, the American armies in the path of the German offensive. The call connected within minutes. "Brad, how fast can you move Patton north?" Bradley's voice came through measured, cautious. His 3rd Armies engaged along the Saar, extracting divisions, pivoting 90 degrees, moving them 100 miles north through winter weather. You're talking about a week minimum. I need it in 3 days. Silence on the line. Then Bradley's voice, hard and now. "Ike, it's not possible. The logistics alone. Make it possible. This isn't a local attack. They're going for Antwerp." Another pause. Bradley processing, calculating. You're sure? I'm sure. And if they take Antwerp, we lose the war for 6 months. Maybe longer. The line went quiet again. Then, I'll talk to Patton. Eisenhower set the phone down. Patton would complain bitterly about giving up his offensive. Patton would argue for continuing the attack in the south, bleeding the Germans there while they wasted strength in the Ardennes. Patton would make the case that the German offensive was actually an opportunity, that attacking into their flanks while they were overextended would destroy them faster than defensive operations. And Patton would be wrong, because Patton was always tactical and never strategic. The man could see a battlefield with perfect clarity, but struggled to see a theater. If the German armor reached the Meuse, if they crossed it, if they drove a wedge between British and American forces, the political consequences would be catastrophic. Churchill would panic. Roosevelt would face calls to negotiate. The alliance would fracture under the strain. The war would be lost even if not a single additional German soldier reached Antwerp, because the appearance of Allied defeat would become its own reality. Eisenhower returned to the map. His eyes moved Bastogne, a small Belgian town he'd never heard of 3 days ago. 7 roads converged there. Every German advance route west funneled through or near it. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the tempo of the entire battle. He picked up the phone again. Get me Middleton. Major General Troy Middleton commanded 8 Corps, the formation that had just been shattered across the Ardennes. The call took longer to connect. Communications in the sector were degraded, lines cut, radio networks jammed. When Middleton's voice finally came through, he sounded exhausted. General. Troy, I need an assessment. Can you hold? Hold what? I've got 3 divisions disintegrating, another encircled, and panzers reported 20 miles behind my forward positions. I need reinforcements yesterday. You're getting them. 101st Airborne and 10th Armored are moving now. The 101st goes to Bastogne. I need that town held. Bastogne. Milton's voice carried the weight of a man watching his command collapse in real time. Sir, I don't know if they'll get there before the Germans do. Then they better move fast. Eisenhower ended the call and stood again, pacing. The 101st Airborne was at Montmolon-le-Grand in France, refitting after Market Garden. They'd be moving within hours, packed into trucks, racing north through the night without proper winter equipment or ammunition resupply. The 10th Armored would come from Patton's 3rd Army, pulled from the Saar offensive before they'd even been told why. Both units would arrive piecemeal, understrength, and low on everything that kept soldiers alive in combat. They'd be facing SS Panzer divisions with weeks of rest, full fuel tanks, and explicit orders to take Bastogne at any cost. But they'd be there, and that changed the equation. The night stretched on. More reports filtered in. A massacre at Malmedy, American prisoners executed by SS troops. German armor stalled at St. Vith where the 7th Armored Division had established a hasty defense. Fuel shortages slowing the panzer spearheads, as captured Allied depots proved less accessible than German planning had assumed. Eisenhower studied each report, fitting pieces into the larger pattern. The German offensive was already behind schedule. Not catastrophically behind, but measurably so. The American units that were supposed to evaporate on contact were fighting harder than Wehrmacht planning had anticipated. Green divisions were standing and dying instead of routing. Experienced divisions were trading space for time in ways that disrupted German timetables. The weather was also wrong. The Germans had attacked during a period of heavy cloud cover that grounded Allied air power, but that same weather turned roads to frozen mud, slowing armor and supply columns. And the forecast suggested a break in the clouds within days, maybe a week. When that happened, Allied air superiority would return, and every German vehicle moving west would be exposed to fighter-bomber attack. The operational window was narrower than the Germans realized. Eisenhower returned to his desk and began drafting orders. Montgomery would take command of all forces north of the breakthrough. Politically unpalatable, but tactically necessary, since Bradley's headquarters was south of the penetration, and communications were failing. British reserves would move to blocking positions along the Meuse. American airborne and armored divisions would rush to critical road junctions. Patton would pivot his entire army north and hit the German southern flank. It was the best he could do with what he had. where he had it. But the realization that kept cycling through his mind as he worked wasn't tactical. It was psychological. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise because Allied intelligence, because he had assumed rational behavior from an enemy no longer operating rationally. Hitler wasn't trying to win the war in any conventional sense. He was trying to break Allied will, force a political settlement, buy time for wonder weapons that existed more in propaganda than reality. This offensive was strategic desperation, disguised as tactical brilliance. And that made it more dangerous, not less, because desperate men fought without regard for sustainable losses. The Wehrmacht would burn to its last reserves of men and material in the Ardennes, but they'd do maximum damage in the process. American casualties would be catastrophic. The Allies would win, eventually, but the butcher's bill would be higher than anything they'd paid since Normandy. Eisenhower signed the last order and set his pen down. Outside, Versailles was dark and quiet, insulated from the battle unfolding 300 miles northeast. Inside his office, the map showed red arrows driving deep into Allied positions, blue unit markers scattered and retreating, roads marked with question marks where no one knew who controlled what. In 3 days, Patton's Third Army would attack north. In 4 days, the weather would clear and Allied aircraft would return to the skies. In a week, the German offensive would stall as fuel ran out and casualties mounted beyond replacement capacity. But tonight, December 16, 1944, the front line was broken. American soldiers were dying in frozen Belgian forests, and the outcome of the battle, maybe the war, rested on whether a few thousand paratroopers could reach an obscure crossroads town before German armor did. Eisenhower looked at the map one more time. Bastogne, 7 roads, a name no one would forget. He turned off the lamp and walked to a window, staring into darkness. The Bulge was breaking his front line, but it wouldn't break his army.